Sleeping with the Beatles. Somehow I survived my unarmed sojourn at 52 Division and made it to the academy for my formal training. Things went quite smoothly during the weeks I spent there, and all my apprehensions about meeting the notorious Sergeant Saul again were unfounded. He was still the gruff old curmudgeon I remembered, but as he had a go at me and the other guys in the class, I was sure that he had his tongue in his cheek. When he paraded us for duty on the second to last day of the course, he had some surprise information for us. "I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for you," he said. "The good news is that you guys are getting out of here a day early. The bad news is that you are all going downtown to guard a bunch of rock and roll fairies with hair down to their arses. They're called the Bugs or something." Although we were all young men and women, only a few of us had heard of the Beatles, and those who claimed to know their music were immediately suspect. We were ordered to show up early the following morning and be prepared for an extra long shift. It didn't seem like a good way to begin a police career. I didn't want to be a bodyguard. I wanted to be on the street, catching criminals and suppressing crime. Then things got worse. When the duties were handed out, I learned that I wasn't even going to be on the street with the rest of my classmates. I had drawn the short straw and was doomed to spend 2 days and nights in the Empire Suite of the King Edward Hotel looking after some weirdos from Britain. I had no idea what they looked or sounded like, and I didn't care. I was at the hotel early that day, patrolling the halls and keeping everybody off the private floor that had been designated for their use. In the early afternoon, something very strange happened. I was still inside, and I felt something change before I actually saw or heard anything. The atmosphere suddenly became charged with excitement, and when I went to a window to see what was going on, I couldn't believe my eyes. The streets were plugged with people for as far as the eye could see. All traffic had come to a standstill, and the pressure of the bulging crowd threatened to push the store windows in. I could see my classmates laughing and joking with the kids in the crowd. Everybody was excited and happy, not at all like the situations described in our training. They were all having fun, and I was stuck in that stuffy old hotel. Sergeant Crawford, the officer in charge of the detail inside the hotel, slapped me on the back and shook me out of my reverie. "Get down to the front door and help get those buggers inside." By the time I got to the doors and made my way to join the dozen or so huge cops waiting outside, things had reached a fevered pitch. "Form a semicircle in front of the doors and lock arms," the patrol sergeant yelled over the noise of the crowd. Members of the mounted unit on excited prancing horses parted the crowd for a long procession of police vehicles, followed by a paddy wagon. The big beige van backed into the secure area we had held in front of the hotel, and its back door flew open. I only got a quick look at the Beatles as they leapt from the wagon and dashed for the hotel lobby, because a surge of crowd pressure hit our protective circle, and I snapped up in the air, suspended between the big guys on either side of me. An enterprising young girl in a white Angora sweater attempted to crawl under my dangling legs to get at the band, but I locked them around her and held her in a scissor hold until the boys were safely inside. It took quite a bit of brushing to get that white hairs off my ass when things settled down. I broke ranks with the group of huge cops outside and followed a separate bunch as they escorted the band members through the crowded lobby and over to a bank of elevators. It was pandemonium. The doors to the lifts hadn't opened as planned, and women were pushing by me and flinging themselves kamikaze-like up and over the wall of policemen. I spotted Sergeant Crawford in front of an elevator away from the main bank. He was holding the door open and waving me over to him. I got there as quickly as I could, and when we pushed the up button and the doors started to close, I could see that the battle in front of the elevators was still going on. We arrived at the private floor, had a quick look around, then stood by and waited for the other elevators to arrive. Eventually the doors opened and a screen of policemen parted to reveal 4 bony young men with long hair and tight pants. They looked like they were having a terrific time as they emerged, breathless, laughing, fiddling with their hair, and straightening their clothes. The whole group brushed past me and hurried down the hall to their suite, and as the door closed I said to myself, "My work here is finished." It was the end of my shift, so I took advantage of the lull to make up my memo book while I waited for my relief to arrive. That's when things went from bad to worse. Sergeant Crawford came back down the hall with his band of big cops in tow, and as I watched, he directed them over to the stairwell and sent them on their way. I knew I was in for it when he came over to me and put his arm around my shoulder and started to speak in a low voice. "Listen, son," he said. "The band manager complained about all the big guys guarding the boys. He says that they were feeling intimidating and starting to refer to them as the goon squad. Anyway," he continued, "I'm putting them down in the lobby, and you, my little friend, are going to spend the night with the band." There's nothing I could do about it, so I found a phone and tried to explain that I couldn't come home because I had to spend the night in the Empire Suite with a rock and roll band. So there it was, just me and Sergeant Crawford and the Beatles. At least that's the way it was supposed to be. The Beatles, a name I was now able to remember, were by this time settled in and running in and out of the rooms in their underwear with drinks in their hands. I took up a position in an easy chair in the corner of the living room while Sergeant Crawford acted as bartender. I was frequently on my feet, answering the door and admitting throngs of strange people, showbiz types, reporters, hookers, etc. In addition to these invited guests, we had visits from all kinds of kids who made incredibly creative attempts to get close to these guys who seemed to be their idols. One of the better attempts was made by a young man who had looted the laundry chute for a busboy uniform and picked up a discarded coffee pot and tray from outside one of the rooms. He was brazenly making his way into the suite as if on room service when I unintentionally touched the coffee pot. It was ice cold, and when I took a closer look at him, I could see his jeans and sandals underneath the white hotel uniform. I let him have a good look at the guys and then escorted him out of the room. There were many similar incidents, and the people that I turned away, many of whom were staying at the hotel, spread the word that I was staying in the Beatles suite. Whenever I went down to the lobby or the restaurant, I was mobbed by kids, mostly girls, who would heap me with gifts that they had made for the various members of the band. I took the presents to the suite and added them to the growing heap of unopened offerings already there. When I went back down to the lobby, I made up stories about how well they were received. At one point, I felt particularly imposed upon when the band's manager recruited me to participate in a little production line he was setting up. He had the boys sitting side by side on a sofa, and they were adding their signatures to small squares of paper and passing them one to the other until they reached me. I was seated next to a guy who said his name was Ringo Starr. I thought he was putting me on, but that was the way the guy signed his name on the paper. It was my job to gather up the autographs and arrange them in piles of 10 and put an elastic band around the bundles. This process went on for quite a while, and when I became bored, I started adding my signature to the last few papers that reached me. We all had a good laugh, and the manager tossed me a large pile for myself. I gave most of them away to the fans in the lobby, and the remainder later on to my friends and relatives that seemed interested in the band. I kept one or two for myself, but have long since lost track of them. One of the Beatles told the sergeant that he had relatives in the city and that he would like to visit them. We devised a plan that got him out of the hotel and back again safely. I think it was George Harrison at the time, but I wasn't sufficiently impressed with him to remember who was who. After 24 hours of non-stop excitement, I don't know when anyone slept, I have to admit that I was starting to enjoy myself, and I kind of missed the boys when they went off to perform at Mayfleet Gardens. After all that time, I was in sore need of a shave and a change of clothes. I didn't think that any of their gear would fit me, but I did accept a disposable razor and some toothpaste from John Lennon. By the time the Beatles were scheduled to leave the city, the crowds of admirers had grown to such huge proportions that the Chief of Police, James Mackey, decided to take personal charge of the special operation to remove them from the hotel. Since Sergeant Crawford and I were most familiar with the boys, we were included as an integral part of the plan. When the time for the band's departure arrived, the chief called 8 of the biggest men on the force into a huddle beside the elevators in the hall of the private floor. "Here's how it's going to work," he said. "The wagon is standing by outside the front doors, and I've got enough men on foot and on horses to keep the crowd back while we load these buggers. Our job is to get them through the lobby and over to the doors. The trouble is," he continued, "I just came up from there and the place is crammed with crazy teenagers. So here's what we're going to do. You 8 men will take the elevator on the left down to the lobby. I'll wait with the band, Sergeant Crawford and the little guy, for precisely 2 minutes, and then we will take the elevator beside you down and join you. In the meantime, I want you boys to move over and form a V in front of our elevator.